All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I pray that you're well and had a good Fajr Salah. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to Surah ʻA'li ʿImrān and to verse number 8, which is a beautiful dua that talks about seeking guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the things we see in the Quran is the multitude of different types of verses. So you have some verses that talk about the qisas and anbiya, the stories of the past, the people that are the heroes and the villains. We also see that there are verses that talk about defining Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For instance, we saw in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allahu la ilaha illahu, al-hayyul qayyum, that He is the living, He is the sustaining one. And we see that there are verses that talk about fiqh, that talk about fasting, about salah, kutiba alaykum as-siyam. But one of the beautiful aspects of the Quran which we see in this verse is the verses that are du'as. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the revelation could have just said, do this, don't do this. And here are some verses about وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى, about the stars, وَالسَّمَاءِ ذَاتِ الْبُرُوجِ. But there are verses that are intentional on how we should call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the questions of the believer is, how do I make a dua? How do I call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do I have my prayers answered? So one of the beautiful things of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us du'as. That, of course, we can create our own dua. We can pray and say things in our own language and ask for specific things. But at the same time, there are du'as in the Quran which we can recite. And there are different types of du'as. There are du'as of the prophets. رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا. That we see Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, when they are leaving the garden, they say, Ya Allah, we made a mistake. We transgressed our own souls. We see that Yunus alayhi salam, when he is in the belly of the whale, he says, La ilaha illa ant. Subhanak inni kuntu min al-zalimin. He said, there is no God except you. Subhanak, glory be to you. Inni kuntu min al-zalimin. I am the one that made a mistake. I'm not blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and other people. I'm taking ownership. And then there are du'as that are meant for the general believers. Of course, we can say the du'as of the anbiya, of the salihin, but there are also du'as that are just du'as that the general believer makes. And we see that this du'a is connected to the previous verses in the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. And this is important because a lot of times people read the Quran and they read each verse one by one. And they look at each surah as a coherence. But there is a connection between Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah ʻA'li ʿImrān. So in the last verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, we see that the believer is praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and saying, Ya Allah, don't make this life difficult for us. Don't put burdens that we cannot bear. رَبَّنَا لَا تُحَمِّلْنَا مَا لَا طَاقَةَ لَنَا بِهِ. Ya Allah, don't give us something that is so difficult and so challenging that we cannot succeed. رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا. Don't try us. Don't give us too many difficulties. And here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this beautiful dua says, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا. So this is a famous dua in the Quran, and it's connected to other verses in the Quran. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah As-Saff talks about the believer and the disbeliever, and says, فَلَمَّا زَاغُوا أَزَاغُ اللَّهُ قُلُوبَهُم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the same verb, and says that the disbelievers, they transgress, they went astray. So what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? أَزَاغُ اللَّهُ قُلُوبَهُم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made their hearts go astray. So sometimes people say, oh, the disbelief, the kufr, that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah didn't guide me. But if someone is going in the path of guidance, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will support them. And if someone chooses to go astray, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let that person go astray. So we have that free will and that choice. And we see that this dua is used especially in the qunut. And we saw in the prayer today, Imam Kabba, mashallah, he led us, and in the second raq'ah, he did the qunut. So this is something that Ahl al-Ilm, they say that it's permissible to do the qunut. And it says, وَالْقُنُوتْ جَائِزْ فِي الْمَغْرَبِ إِنْدَ جَمَاعَةٍ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ. So many of the scholars say the qunut, this is a prayer that people say in the qunut, and it's permissible in the Maghrib prayer. وَفِي كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ أَيْضًا. So this is an opinion of Imam Qurtubi, where he says any prayer, you're allowed to do the qunut. If there is something with the Muslimin, if there's something wrong going on, some issue, an affair, wherever in the land. So إذا دهم المسلمين أمر عظيم يفرغهم ويخافون منه على أنفسهم. So if the Muslims are afraid and they're scared and there's some transgression, then they are allowed to do the qunut in the prayer. It's not a regular thing necessarily, but it's a special thing. And many of the ulama say that this prayer, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا, is one of the prayers that you can say in the qunut. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after talking about not letting our hearts go astray, says, وَهَبْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً. And Ya Allah, give us لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً. And the ulama and the mufassirin, they say, مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً عِنْدَكَ رَحْمَةً. That you possess the mercy. And we see that ʿImrān was revealed in Mecca. And we know that at that time there were Jewish tribes from the lineage of Bani Israel. And they had this conception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being strong, qawi al-aziz, but not necessarily ar-Rahman, that He was merciful. Because if you have a conception of that God is strong and mighty, then you become afraid of God, and then you're in awe of God. And even to the point that some religious traditions, they don't even say God's name because they're afraid of God. But we, as Muslims, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ar-Rahman. And He's ar-Rahim, bil-mu'minina ar-Rahima, that to the believers He's kind and merciful. So we're praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, Ya Allah, give us some of your mercy. Because we know you are the source of mercy. That you are ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And that in our lives, we're looking for mercy. That there are difficult moments, difficult times. We know that there are challenging moments that we need to call out to your name. We need your support and we need your guidance. And we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concludes this saying, إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْوَهَّابِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are the source of bestowing. And one of the beautiful things I love about the Quran is how the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are incorporated. So you see that this prayer starts saying, Ya Allah, don't let our hearts go astray. Then you ask for mercy, and then you call to one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Wahhab. And we see that this name is important in the Quran. It's repeated many times, especially dealing with family and children. So we see that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says, Alhamdulillah alladhi wahaba li ala kibri Ismail wal Ishaq. He says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh Allah, I'm so happy. Praise be to you that you bestowed on me. Wahaba li ala kibri. I was an old man. I thought I was done having children. But then you gave me Ismail wa Ishaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability to give children, to give families. And we know this verb also, and this name, when we say, رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ. Ya Allah, give us what? هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاج. We want good spouses, righteous. هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا. And righteous progeny. We want children, that after we die and pass away from this earth, there will be people still remembering us, praying for us, making dhikr, that they're making salawat, they are doing ta'ah, worshipping, obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that even though we are dead and in our graves, we are reaping the reward. And we see that this particular prayer was a prayer that the Sahaba used to make. And it's connected to other prayers of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So one of the hadith of Salama, who was one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and one of the mukthirat, she used to say many things because she was in the household of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So she saw what he said and what he did. She was the wife who on Hudaybiyah, when no one was listening about doing the udhiyah, she told the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, go out you do the udhiyah, you do the sacrifice, and people will follow you. And he went out, he did the sacrifice, and then everyone sacrificed, and then they went home, and then the following year they came and they did the umrah. So she narrates this beautiful hadith that one of the prayers that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to make is Ya muqallib al-qulub thabbit qalbi ala dinik. That, oh, the one who changes the hearts, make my heart firm on your religion. And some of the companions hearing this, they said, is it true that our hearts can switch like that? And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said yes, that the hearts of the believer are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that He can flip it at any moment. And we see this in our life. Some days our iman is strong, other days it's weak. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to thabbit, to make our hearts firm on your religion. And we see that this particular dua was something that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used to say. And there was one of the Sahaba, he used to pray next to Abu Bakr. And he heard him say it. So he narrates in this very beautiful hadith that he says that أَنَّهُ صَلَّى وَرَاءَ أَبِي بَكْرٍ, that I used to pray behind Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu al-Maghrib. So he used to pray Maghrib Salah with Abu Bakr. فَقَرَأَ أَبُو بَكْرٍ فِي رَقَعَتَيْنِ الْأَوَّلَيْنِ بِأُمِّ الْقُرْآنِ. So in the first two rak'ahs, he used to pray Abu Bakr al-Qur'an, which is Surah Al-Fatiha, وَسُورَتَيْنِ مِنْ قِصَارٍ مُفَصَّلٍ, and then two surahs that were short and manageable. وَقَرَأَ الرَّقَعَ الثَّالِثَةَ قَالَ فَدَنَوْتُ مِنْهُ حَتَّى أَنَّ ثِيَابِي تَكَادُ تَمَسُّ ثِيَابَهُ. So on the third rak'ah, the companions, and this shows how they wanted to learn from one another. So he stood next to Abu Bakr and he kind of leaned, he wanted to hear. And the third rak'ah, as you know, is silent. Right? So this companion, he kind of leaned a little bit closer. He wanted to see what is the dua that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used to say. فَسَمِعْتُ يَقْرَأ بِأُمِّ الْقُرْآنِ. So I heard him recite silently Surah Fatiha. وَهَذِهِ آيَةٌ. And he used to recite this. After he would recite Surah Fatiha, he would say, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا. So this was a dua that the companions, they used to say frequently because they wanted to make sure that their hearts were firm on the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, one of the things as we start this new khatam, starting from the beginning to the end of the Qur'an, I would encourage myself and all of you to focus on the du'as of the Qur'an. And this could be a class in itself. Because one of the questions about any relationship is, how do you request something? How do you request something from your wife or your kids or from your father or mother? Right? Any relationship has a request. You're asking the other person to do something for you. So the question is, how do we form this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So part of the relationship that we form is based on the du'as. That part of the believer, they're constantly making dhikr, or remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, requesting things. So this is a very famous dua that I would encourage all of us to memorize and to say in our daily prayers or in our daily lives. And we see here the importance of guidance of the hearts. That the heart is mentioned so many times in the Qur'an. And that the pure heart, بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, on the Day of Judgment is the heart that's going to be rewarded and given paradise. So we always have to think about where is our heart? Is our heart leaning towards ta'ah, obedience? Is it leaning towards transgression? What is our state? Are we happy? Are we sad? Are we feeling depressed? Are we feeling enthusiastic? Because these emotional state is very much connected to our identity and our religious and spiritual state. So we should always be in touch with what our heart is feeling and making sure that it's on the correct path. And lastly, we see one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's mentioned, Al-Wahhab. And this is a name that's repeated. And we also know the verb wahaba is frequently used in the Qur'an. And it's used to talk about mercy. That we want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us mercy. We want us to give us guidance. We want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us righteous children. We want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a righteous spouse, a husband and a wife. So this is a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we should connect with and that we should use in our prayers. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.